Derek. So we are in week 4 of our Resurrected study of talking about the encounters that people had with Jesus post-resurrection. And so today we're talking about the Emmaus Road. So this is a story that I think a lot of people tend to skip over, but it's really important because I think it relates to how a lot of us feel at different times in our faith journey.
Yeah, that's fair.
But these two guys are walking the Emmaus Road. So it's 7 miles to Emmaus from Jerusalem, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in that time when you're walking 7 miles,
that'd be a long walk for me. I don't think
right.
I've ever walked 7 miles straight.
Honestly, I don't know if I have either. But on this road, so it's actually the same day. So it's still Sunday. And these two guys are talking about what has happened the last few days in Jerusalem. And they have to be confused because they have seen Jesus die. But then we're just talking in scripture. It says they were discussing that the women told them that the tomb was empty. And so they're having this conversation and this stranger comes up to them, unbeknownst to them, it's Jesus. And it's so interesting because he disguises himself and asks, "What are you guys talking about?" And so from there, they kind of explain their hearts. And the thing that stands out to me in this is in verse 21, it says, "But we had hoped." Gosh, and I think that for me, like I have said that to the Lord so many times, like I have hoped for this, I'd hoped for that. And it's interesting because then Jesus just tells them who he is in a way that they don't really understand quite yet, because he talks about scripture to them and talks about how so many scriptures in the Old Testament point to his resurrection and who he is as Messiah. They still don't know who he is at this point. And they get back to the house, and then it's interesting also because Jesus comes in and they break bread together, and then it is revealed to them that it is Jesus. Then he disappears.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this like really crazy, weird story of Jesus appearing to them, but then disappearing and not really revealing who he is. But I think there's so many lessons here for us talking about taking our disappointment and turning it to expectation. And so kind of going back to that "we had hoped" phrase. I know for me, I've had a lot of times in my life where I've said, I have hoped for this and hoped for that. But how do you think those two guys felt on the road to Emmaus?
Yeah, I think, how they're feeling probably this ultimate form of disappointment, because they had completely uprooted their lives to follow what they thought was the Messiah, and I still think in many ways that Jesus is going to surprise them, in many ways of who he is, even greater than what their expectations are, but their expectations are so low right now because they're thinking, we've seen him do all these things and now he's dead, and what now? Yeah. And I think for me, Sarah, when I start to think about like how I would relate to these guys and in my life with like, but we had hoped, I think one of the biggest hesitations in my life and one of my biggest fears is to fully jump into something and then the rug be pulled out from beneath me. And because then I feel like an idiot. Yeah. Because then I'm left feeling exposed. I'm left feeling naked and just feel like an idiot. Yeah. And I've had those experiences in my life and I've hated it. Like I hate that feeling. And so, but with Christ, he's consistently calling us to not be that way. Right. He wants us to enter in to being all in with him. And so I can totally relate. I'd be disappointed. I'd be frustrated. I would and pretty bummed out.
But I think you hit on something about our expectations, right? I found a quote from Lisa Turkhurst, and she said, "Our favorite story to tell ourselves is how our lives should have been." Because I think a lot of times when we do pray for things, we have an idea of how we want it to go. I know for me, like I thought my life as a 31-year-old would look way different than it does now, but it's still good. And the Lord has still blessed me in so many different ways, but my expectations are different, right? Like they might not have been met in certain areas of my life, but it's still good. And I love talking about like the story of Abraham and Sarah, right? Like the Lord tells them like, hey, you're going to be a father to a multitude, thousands, millions of people. And they're thinking, oh, so we're going to have 1 million children? But no. It's through Isaac and through the lineage. The promise is still true, but it looks different than what they expect. And I think this is directly related to this Emmaus Road, right? Because they had an expectation of who Jesus was. They thought, they even say like, we had hoped that he was going to be the one to redeem Israel. And they thought that he was going to overthrow the kingdom and bring forth a new kingdom. But that kingdom looks a lot different than what they expected.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a very real sense that God's will for our life will always be different than what our hopes and dreams are. Like, I know for me growing up and at different churches I was in, I was always taught that like, hey, you pray these huge prayers and God's going to make them come true. And if it's not coming true, it means that like you've done something wrong or you have sin in your life. And what changed that perspective for me was reading scripture, because I got to college and I started reading scripture and had friends that had encouraged actually reading scripture. And it changed my life, because it was like, man, there are so many people in here who go through these ups and downs in life. And what I'm hearing at these churches I was at before and listening to in books I was reading is contrasting what I'm seeing in scripture, And so I had to have that reality check of like, okay, like the Lord is good and he is kind and he loves us. However, he also knows what it's going to take for us to get to the place that he wants us to be as a person. And so unfortunately, that doesn't mean that every single dream we're going to have is going to come true. There's going to be sacrifice. There's going to be longing. But there's also going to be joy. There's going to be unexpected joy. And that's where these guys, they're about to walk into.
Yeah, it's funny that you say scriptures, because that's just what Jesus does to them, right? Unbeknownst to them, again, that it's Jesus. But he points them back to these different scriptures that talk all about himself. And I think that's so important for us. Like when we are in these moments of unmet expectations and disappointment, we need to remind ourselves to look back and see who God has been in our lives before, right? And remind ourselves of his faithfulness. And I think when we're on that road, sometimes we don't understand that in the moment, right? But we can look back and see that he was there the whole time.
Yeah. And I think even for my family right now, different things that we're praying for, I think God continually reminds me that like it's a good thing to pray for those things. It's a good thing to be a person who has expectation and hope and dream. Like we want to be optimistic people and hope-filled people. Like that's who we should be. But then again, at the same time, I think what the Lord continues to teach me is to pray for the joy and strength and endurance that comes with his will coming true in our life. And I have to remind myself that even my greatest dreams that I think are going to fulfill me more than anything I could ever imagine will never come close to the satisfaction and completeness that I'm going to have in eternity with Christ. And so we talk about what that gift looks like and the expectation. We can get kicked in the teeth every day for the rest of our life, or we could have the best life imaginable. And yet none of that is going to compare. And even almost, it's not even going to be worth mentioning because of the glory of who Jesus is, and just of being in his presence is going to be so much greater than anything we could experience here.